A tiny German Shepherd puppy was clawing at the 118-degree Nevada asphalt, her pads blistering, yet she refused to let go. In her small teeth, she gripped the handle of a heavy-duty contractor bag, dragging her suffocating mother across the vibrating shoulder of Interstate 80. Most drivers saw roadside litter and accelerated, but for Elias Thorne, a man who had already buried his heart in the sands of the Middle East, this was a tactical emergency he couldn't ignore. One more mile of searing heat, one more minute of oxygen deprivation, and that white plastic would have become a permanent tomb. What Elias discovered when he finally pulled his rig over didn't just save a dog. It forced a broken warrior to confront the one thing he thought he'd left behind in the desert, a reason to stay. But as the puppy stood her ground against the towering trucker, a chilling question remained. Who had tied the bag so tight that no animal could ever hope to escape it? Question mark. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The heat over the Great Basin wasn't just a temperature, it was a weight. In July 2026, the Nevada desert shimmered with a deceptive beauty, the horizon blurring into a hazy line of sagebrush and salt flats. The interior of the Peterbilt 579 smelled of stale coffee and the metallic hum of the PACCAR MX-13 engine. Elias Thorne, 42, sat high in the air ride seat, his hands steady on the wheel, though his mind was miles away, trapped in a 2021 deployment in Erbil. His face was a map of hard miles, scarred knuckles, salt and pepper stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sea that had long ago stopped looking for land. He lived by the logbook now. Every mile was a second away from a past he couldn't fix. He was a man who had mastered the art of moving on, without ever actually going anywhere. The road was a quiet tunnel of heat until he saw the anomaly. A flash of dark fur and a scrap of white plastic moving against the grain of the wind. Elias slowed the massive rig, the air brakes hissing like a warning. Most would have seen a stray and kept their foot on the gas to avoid the paperwork of a life. But Elias saw the way the puppy, Peaches, planted her feet. She wasn't scavenging. She was performing an extraction. Beside her, the contractor bag puffed out and collapsed, a shallow, desperate rhythm of a creature losing the battle for air. Elias felt a phantom weight in his chest, the same heaviness he felt when his canine partner, Jax, died in his arms 5 years prior. He told himself he didn't have room for another tragedy. He had a delivery in Elko and a schedule to keep. But as he watched the puppy tug at the slick plastic with a raw, guttural growl, his combat medic training overrode his cynicism. Not today, he rasped, his voice sounding foreign in the quiet cab. Not on my watch. Gravel crunched under his boots as he stepped out into the kiln-like air. He reached for his Leatherman Wave Plus and the IFAK clipped to his belt. As he approached, the puppy didn't flee. She stood over the bag, her tiny frame shaking with exhaustion and heatstroke, her dark eyes locked onto his. She was guarding her mother, Daisy, with the same no-man-left-behind ferocity Elias had once seen in his own unit. The ordinary rhythm of the interstate had fractured. Elias Thorne wasn't just stopping for a dog. He was stepping back into a war he thought he'd resigned from. A war for a life that was currently running out of time inside a knotted bag. The heat at mile marker 242 was a physical entity, a shimmering wall of 118-degree Nevada air that turned the Great Basin desert into a kiln. Inside the cab of his Peterbilt 579, Elias Thorne wiped a streak of oily sweat from his brow. His jaw tight as the air conditioning vents emitted nothing but a pathetic, lukewarm sigh. It was July 2026, and the world outside the windshield looked like a scorched earth painting, the asphalt of Interstate 80 vibrating under the relentless sun. Elias shifted his weight in the worn leather seat, his hands, scarred from years of turning wrenches and holding pressure on arterial bleeds, gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. For the last 4 years, the hum of the PACCAR engine had been his only sanctuary, a rhythmic barrier between his present and the ghosts of Erbil that still haunted his sleep. He was a man who lived by the logbook, a 42-year-old former Army combat medic, 68W, who had traded his stethoscope for a long-haul rig to escape the burden of saving things. Just 60 more miles to Elko, he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel in an empty drum. He reached for a lukewarm bottle of water, his eyes scanning the horizon where the heat haze turned the sagebrush into dancing shadows. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like a discarded tire carcass or a bundle of rags caught in the wind. A small, dark shape moved near the shoulder, struggling against the weight of something white and bulky. Elias didn't slow down. Experience had taught him that the desert was a graveyard for many things, and his schedule didn't have room for mercy. "Just a coyote," he muttered, his thumb hovering over the cruise control. "Keep your eyes on the lane, Thorn. It's just a dog." He tried to look away to focus on the pale ribbon of road ahead, but the shape moved again. It wasn't a coyote. It was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 10 weeks old, its dark fur matted with dust. It was Peaches. She wasn't running, she was anchored. With a stubborn, primeval determination, the puppy had her teeth sunk into the handle of a heavy-duty white contractor bag, her small legs tensed as she tried to drag the massive weight toward the center of the road. Elias felt the familiar, cold knot of operational cynicism tighten in his chest. He knew the look of an abandoned animal, but this was different. This wasn't a stray looking for a handout. This was a soldier on a mission. Still, he kept his foot on the pedal. He remembered Jax, his canine partner who had died in a dusty street in 2021 because Elias hadn't been fast enough with the tourniquet. He had sworn never to let another living thing depend on him. The puppy saw the massive chrome grille of the Peterbilt bear down on her. Instead of bolting for the safety of the ditch, Peaches let go of the bag and scrambled into the very center of the lane. She sat down on the blistering asphalt, tilting her head back to let out a piercing raw yelp that seemed to cut right through the roar of the diesel engine. "Damn it!" Elias roared, his hand slamming onto the air brake lever. The Peterbilt shuddered, the tires screaming against the heat-softened pavement as the trailer fishtailed slightly. A cloud of acrid blue smoke and the smell of burnt rubber filled the air as the massive truck ground to a halt just yards from the tiny trembling dog. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the cooling engine and the whistle of the wind. Elias sat in the cab, his chest heaving. He wanted to scream, to put the truck back in gear and drive around the problem. But when he looked through the windshield, Peaches didn't move. She just stared up at the cab, her eyes wide and glossy with a fear that Elias recognized all too well. It was the look of someone waiting for a miracle they didn't truly believe would come. Gravel crunched under his heavy work boots as he stepped out of the cab. The heat hit him like a physical blow, a suffocating blanket that smelled of hot oil and sage. He walked toward the puppy, intending to shoo her toward the brush so he could get back on his route. "Go on, get," he barked, waving his arms. "You're gonna get yourself killed out here." Peaches didn't budge. She barked once, a sharp, commanding sound, and turned back to the white bag on the shoulder. She grabbed the handle again, tugging with a frantic, desperate energy. Elias stopped. He looked at the bag. It was tied shut with industrial-grade zip ties, the plastic stretched thin and translucent in the sun. And then the bag moved. It didn't just shift, it heaved. A slow, agonizing expansion followed by a sickeningly thin collapse. Lift, fall, lift, fall. It was the rhythm of air hunger. It was the sound of a creature, Daisy, running out of time in a vacuum-sealed tomb. The trucker's world shifted. The lone wolf, hermit vanished, and the combat medic returned with a force that made his heart thunder against his ribs. He wasn't at mile marker 242 anymore. He was back in the dead zone, where seconds were the difference between life and a body bag. "Extraction initiated," he whispered, the old tactical mantra falling from his lips like a prayer. He didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted back to the cab of his truck. He didn't reach for his logbook or his phone. Instead, his hand dove into the side compartment, emerging with his Leatherman Wave Plus and his IFAK, individual first aid kit. The black nylon pouch of the trauma kit felt heavy and familiar in his grip, the red cross on the front a stark reminder of the skills he had tried to forget. He ran back to the shoulder, the heat of the asphalt searing through the soles of his boots. Peaches backed away just enough to let him in, her whimpers turning into a low, frantic hum. Elias knelt in the dirt, the serrated blade of the Leatherman catching the midday sun as he positioned it over the plastic. He could see the fog of moisture on the inside of the bag, the condensation of a final, desperate breath. He knew that the moment he punctured the plastic, the sudden rush of oxygen could be a blessing or a final shock to a failing system. He gripped the heavy zip ties that had been knotted with a professional, cruel precision, and realized that whoever had done this hadn't just left these dogs to die, they had made sure of it. The heat radiating from the asphalt was a physical weight, but Elias Thorne didn't feel it anymore. The only thing that mattered was the rhythmic, agonizing heave of the white contractor bag. He knelt in the grit of the shoulder, his knees screaming as they pressed into the blistering stones, but his hands were steady. This was the golden hour, that razor-thin margin between life and the void that he had navigated 1,000 times in the dust of the Middle East. He wasn't a trucker right now. He was a 68W with a patient on the table. He slid the serrated edge of his Leatherman Wave Plus into the top layer of the plastic. It didn't give easily. As he sliced, he realized with a jolt of cold fury that this wasn't just a trash bag. It was triple wrapped, 3 layers of heavy-duty, puncture-resistant polyethylene. Whoever had done this hadn't just been discarding a problem. They had been engineering an execution. Easy, easy, Elias muttered, his voice a low, tactical hum. He had to be surgical. If he slipped, the blade would catch the skin of the animal struggling inside. He peeled back the final layer of plastic, and the smell hit him. A sickening cocktail of trapped CO2, wet fur, and the metallic tang of extreme heat distress. Daisy slumped out of her plastic tomb like a fallen soldier. She was a beautiful German shepherd, or she had been before the trauma. Now, her black and tan fur was soaked with sweat and condensation, her limbs were stiff and awkward, and her tongue, long and swollen, was a terrifying shade of cyanotic blue. "She's in respiratory arrest," Elias whispered, his fingers flying to the femoral artery. The pulse was thready, a faint, erratic tapping that felt like a dying bird against his fingertips. Peaches, seeing the man handling her limp mother, let out a frantic, high-pitched shriek. She lunged, her tiny needle-like teeth sinking into the heavy leather of Elias's tactical work boots. She growled, a sound far too big for her 10-week-old body, shaking her head as she tried to tear through the cowhide to protect her only world. "I know, kid. I know," Elias grunted, ignoring the sharp pressure on his ankle. "But you have to let me work." He reached into his IFAK and pulled out a bag valve mask, BVM. It was designed for a human adult, but in the field, you learned to improvise or people died. He cleared Daisy's airway, pulling her tongue forward to ensure no obstruction, and placed the mask over her muzzle. He used his large hand to create a seal against her fur, his thumb and forefinger forming the C shape he'd practiced until it was muscle memory. With his other hand he squeezed the bag. 1, 2, 3. He watched her chest. Nothing. He adjusted the seal and squeezed again, harder this time. 1, 2, 3. A faint rise. He followed the breath with chest compressions, placing the heel of his hand over the widest part of her rib cage, right behind the elbow. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The asphalt burned his skin through his jeans, and the sun beat down on the back of his neck like a hammer, but he was locked into the rhythm of the save. "Come on, Daisy," he hissed, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't you dare quit. Not after she dragged you this far." Peaches continued her assault on his boots, her whimpers turning into a desperate, sobbing howl. The sound was an arrow straight to the part of Elias he had tried to keep frozen. It sounded like every mother, every brother, every partner he'd ever lost. It sounded like Jack's. He didn't stop. 10 minutes passed in a blur of sweat and desperate effort. His muscles were screaming, and the operational cynicism that usually kept him numb was being burned away by the sheer, stubborn will of the puppy beside him. He gave one final powerful squeeze of the BVM and a sharp downward thrust on the ribs. Daisy's body suddenly convulsed. A ragged, wet gasp tore from her throat, followed by a violent cough that sprayed flecks of foam against the inside of the mask. Her chest began to move, shallow, uneven, but independent. Elias slumped back on his heels, his lungs burning. He watched as the blue tint slowly receded from her tongue, replaced by a pale, sickly pink. Slowly, agonizingly, Daisy's eyelids flickered. They fluttered open, revealing amber eyes that were clouded with a level of terror that made Elias's blood run cold. She didn't look at him with gratitude. She looked at him with a shattered expression, the look of a creature that had realized the hand that feeds can also be the hand that kills. She let out a low, broken whine, her gaze shifting to Peaches, who had finally let go of Elias's boot and was now frantically licking her mother's face. Elias reached out a trembling hand to steady her, but his eyes caught something on the discarded plastic. He reached down and picked up the heavy-duty zip ties he had cut away. They weren't the cheap, brittle ones you found in a hardware store. These were high-tensile, heat-resistant, black nylon ties used in industrial construction and high-security fencing. He turned the tie over in his hand, spotting a specific embossed serial number and a logo he recognized from his days hauling specialized freight. These hadn't been picked up at a local shop. They were part of a restricted inventory used by a specific land development firm he'd seen on his route. This wasn't an act of random cruelty. This was an execution carried out with professional-grade tools by someone who knew exactly how long it would take for a dog to suffocate in the Nevada sun. As Elias looked from the industrial ties to the traumatized mother dog, a shadow fell over the asphalt. He looked up, expecting to see a passing motorist, but the vehicle stopping behind his rig wasn't a civilian car. It was a dark, government-issue SUV with tinted windows, and as the door opened, Elias realized that his extraction might have just put him in the crosshairs of something much more dangerous than the desert heat. The dust plume on the horizon wasn't a mirage. It was a thick, tan rooster tail of Nevada silt rising from a vehicle moving fast along the service road adjacent to Interstate 80. Elias Thorne, still kneeling on the scorched gravel, shielded Daisy with his own shadow, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt since his final patrol in Erbil. He gripped the black nylon of his IFAK, his thumb tracing the serrated edge of the Leatherman Wave Plus he had used to slice through the industrial-grade zip ties. The vehicle, a dark, government-issue SUV with the gold emblem of the Bureau of Land Management on the door, screeched to a halt behind his stalled Peterbilt 579. The dust hadn't even settled when the door flew open. "Stay exactly where you are. Hands where I can see them." The voice was authoritative, sharp as a crack of a whip. Elias didn't move his hands from Daisy's side, but he flattened his palms against her hot fur. "I'm a medic," he called out, his voice raspy from the desert air. "I have an emergency extraction in progress." She's stabilized, but she's crashing from heat stroke. Sarah, a BLM ranger with sun-bleached hair tucked under a tactical cap and eyes that scanned the scene with professional intensity, stepped into the shimmering heat. Her hand rested on her belt, but as she saw the discarded contractor bag, the triple-layer plastic and the tiny, defiant puppy known as Peaches standing guard over the dying mother, her posture shifted from suspicion to grim realization. "Mile marker 242, she muttered into the radio on her shoulder. "Dispatch, I have a code red animal cruelty case and a civilian medic on site. We need a vet lead in Elko." "Copy?" She stepped closer, the heat radiating off the asphalt at 118 degrees making the air between them ripple. She looked at the blue-tongued German shepherd and then at Elias's rig. "Your truck," Sarah said, pointing to the idling Peterbilt. "Is the AC running?" "It's dead," Elias grunted, the irony of the situation tasting like copper in his mouth. "The compressor blew 50 miles back. The cab is a furnace. I was trying to make Elko before I realized I was hauling more than just freight." Sarah looked at the dogs, then at the vast empty stretch of the Great Basin. "We're 40 miles from the nearest clinic in Elko," she said, her voice dropping the command tone for one of urgent partnership. "In this heat, she won't last 20 minutes in a truck without air. My SUV is at max cooling. We have to move them. Now." Moving a trauma patient was always the riskiest part of a save. Elias signaled to Peaches, who was still trembling but had stopped growling at him. "Help me, kid," he whispered. He slid his arms under Daisy's limp body, feeling the terrifying heat still radiating from her core. He lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder, her weight a reminder of everything he had failed to carry in the past. They moved with a synchronized, tactical grace. Sarah opened the rear hatch of the SUV, the blast of chilled air from the vents feeling like a miracle against their sweat-soaked skin. They laid Daisy on a cooling blanket Sarah had pulled from her kit. Peaches scrambled in immediately, pressing her small, dusty body against her mother's flank, refusing to be left behind. Elias stood at the bumper, the cool air from the interior beckoning him, but he looked back at his rig. The Peterbilt sat on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking, a lonely sentinel holding a multi-thousand-dollar load of specialized freight. To leave it was to violate every protocol of the road. His company would fire him before he hit the city limits. His career, the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay, was idling on the edge of a desert cliff. Sarah saw him hesitate. She looked at the truck, then at the digital thermometer on her dash. "Thorne, if we don't move in 60 seconds, the transition shock will kill her." Elias looked at Daisy's flickering eyelids, then at the discarded industrial zip ties he had stuffed into his pocket, the evidence of a calculated execution. He thought of the logbook, the delivery schedule, and the operational cynicism that had been his only armor for 4 years. "The freight can wait," Elias said, his voice hardening with a resolve he thought he'd buried in a desert far away. "They can't." He slammed the SUV's hatch shut and climbed into the back beside the dogs, leaving his life's work on the side of a lonely highway. As Sarah floored the accelerator, the SUV fishtailed onto the asphalt, the siren beginning its long, mournful wail toward Elko. Elias gripped a handhold as they sped away, but as he glanced out the rear window at his receding truck, he saw something that made his blood run colder than the SUV's air conditioning. A second vehicle, a white pickup he hadn't noticed before, pulled out from behind a stand of distant sagebrush and came to a stop exactly where the Peterbilt was parked. The Bureau of Land Management SUV tore through the shimmering heat of Interstate 80, the speedometer needle hovering near 90. Sarah had the sirens screaming, a lonely, high-pitched wail that was swallowed by the vastness of the Great Basin. Inside the cabin, the air conditioning was a frigid contrast to the hell outside, but for Elias Thorne, the temperature was irrelevant. He was back in the box, the cramped, high-stress environment of a moving casualty extraction. He sat on the floor of the rear cargo area, his back against the side panel, bracing himself as Sarah took a curve with aggressive, tactical precision. Daisy's head was rested on his lap, her breathing shallow and thready. Peaches had tucked herself into the crook of Elias's arm, her tiny heart beating like a trip hammer against his ribs. Every few seconds, Daisy's amber eyes would flutter open, rolling back in a daze of heat-induced delirium. Elias looked down, and for a split second, the Nevada desert faded away. The smell of chilled air was replaced by the suffocating, metallic tang of scorched earth and spent C4. The year was 2021, and the setting was a narrow, rubble-strewn alley in Erbil, Iraq. Elias was a younger man then, his 68W medic patch caked in the fine yellow dust of the Middle East. He was kneeling in a pool of hydraulic fluid and blood, his hands deep in the fur of a Belgian Malinois named Jax. An IED had turned their routine patrol into a nightmare. Jax, the unit's specialized detection dog, had taken the brunt of the blast. Elias could still hear the ringing in his ears, the distant rattle of M4 fire, and the frantic voice of his sergeant screaming for a medevac that was 10 minutes out. He had fought. He had used every hemostatic dressing in his kit, every ounce of his training to plug the wounds, but Jax had looked at him with that same shattered expression, a look of profound confusion and fading life. Jax had died in his arms 3 minutes before the bird arrived. Elias had carried that failure like a second heartbeat for 5 years, a steady, unrelenting pulse of guilt that had eventually driven him into the cab of a Peterbilt 579. Thorne? Talk to me. Sarah's voice snapped him back to 2026. Elias blinked, the desert glare returning. He looked at Daisy. Her tongue was still pale and her pulse was fluttering. He saw Jax's eyes in hers, the same amber, the same plea for a mercy he hadn't been able to provide. She's trending downward, Elias rasped, his voice thick. He adjusted the seal of the BVM he was holding ready. He leaned down, his forehead almost touching Daisy's ear. Not this time, he whispered, a vow that felt heavier than the truck he'd left behind. Not on my watch. He reached out to check the 4-line Sarah had helped him start, but as he turned, his eyes caught the side mirror. Far behind them, a white silhouette was cutting through the heat haze. It was the pickup truck from the shoulder, the one that had stopped near his rig. It wasn't fading. In fact, it was gaining ground, weaving through the sparse afternoon traffic with a reckless disregard for safety. Sarah, we've got a tail, Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, combat-ready tone. Sarah glanced at her rearview mirror, her brow furrowing. A white Ford F-150. No plates on the front. Is that the same one you saw by your rig? Matches the description, Elias said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the industrial-grade zip ties. He looked at the serial numbers again, then back at the white truck. The realization hit him like a kinetic strike. Whoever had discarded Daisy didn't just want her gone. They wanted to ensure she stayed buried. And now they had a witness. They're coming up fast, Sarah noted, her hand moving to the radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger 4 Alpha. I have a suspicious vehicle following at high speed. Requesting backup on I-80 eastbound, approaching the Elko cutoff. The radio crackled with static, a dead, empty hiss that made Elias's stomach sink. Sarah, we're in the dead zone, he reminded her. The vast mineral deposits in this part of the basin were notorious for eating signals. They were 40 miles from help, hauling a dying dog, and being pursued by someone with professional-grade tools and a motive for murder. The white truck suddenly swerved, pulling into the left lane and accelerating. It was no longer just following, it was positioning itself to pit them. Elias looked at Peaches, who was staring at the rear window, her fur standing on end as she let out a low, vibrating growl. He looked back at Daisy, whose breath hitched as she struggled to maintain her grip on life. He had abandoned a multi-$1,000 load and his entire career on the side of that road. He had nothing left to lose except the 2 lives currently resting in the back of this SUV. Hold on, Sarah barked, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as she saw the white truck lunge toward their rear quarter panel. Elias braced himself over Daisy, shielding her body with his own. As the SUV swerved to avoid the collision, Elias noticed something on the side of the white pickup. A small, faded logo of a land development firm that matched the one he'd seen on his specialized freight manifests. The horror of the situation deepened. This wasn't just random cruelty, It was a corporate cleanup, and as the white truck pulled level with the SUV's window, Elias saw the driver reach for something that definitely wasn't a cell phone. The white Ford F-150 didn't just want to pass, it wanted to erase the evidence. As Sarah veered the SUV onto the Elko exit, the pickup lunged. Its chrome bumper missed their rear quarter panel by a fraction of an inch as the tires screamed against the hot Nevada asphalt. Inside the rear hatch, Elias Thorne was a human shock absorber, his large frame braced against the side panels to keep Daisy from sliding. He looked through the tinted rear glass and saw the driver of the white truck, a man with a face like sun-baked leather and a cold, predatory focus, reach for a black shape on the passenger seat. "Sarah, he's got a sidearm." Elias roared over the wail of the siren. Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed on the brakes, the ABS system pulsing through the floorboards like a heartbeat. The white pickup, caught off guard by the sudden deceleration, surged past them. Sarah immediately whipped the steering wheel to the right, jumping the curb and cutting through a vacant gas station lot to bypass the main intersection. The SUV's suspension groaned under the strain, but they gained precious seconds as the pickup was forced to navigate a U-turn through Elko's midday traffic. "We're 2 minutes out," Sarah yelled, her knuckles white on the wheel. "Thorne, how is she?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He was staring at Daisy's chest. The shallow, rhythmic rise he had fought so hard to restore had vanished. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for the thready femoral pulse that had been his only anchor. "She's flatlining," Elias rasped, his voice dropping into the terrifyingly calm tone of a medic in a mass cal event. "She's in full arrest. Move, Sarah. Move." They screeched into the gravel lot of the small-town veterinary office in Elko, the tires kicking up a cloud of pale dust. Sarah was out of the door before the engine had even stopped, screaming for help. Elias didn't wait. He scooped Daisy into his arms, her body dangerously hot and limp as a rag doll, and sprinted through the clinic doors. Peaches was a blur of dark fur at his heels, her frantic yaps echoing off the sterile walls. The waiting room was a chaos of locals and their pets, but Elias cut through the crowd with the command of a man who had cleared hallways in Herbal. "I need a crash cart and chilled saline. Now." The vet, a young woman named Dr. Aris who looked like she hadn't slept since the heat wave started, emerged from a back room, her eyes wide at the sight of the giant, sweat-soaked trucker holding a dying German shepherd. She saw the military-grade IFAK on his belt and the BVM in his hand and pointed to an open exam table. "Get her back here." As they laid Daisy down, the clinic's digital thermometer blinked a lethal 106 degrees. Daisy was in profound heat stroke, her system shutting down from the inside out. Dr. Aris reached for an 4 kit, but her hands were trembling, the sheer volume of emergency cases from the once-in-a-century storm clearly taking their toll. "I've got the line," Elias said, his voice a low, steadying frequency. He reached out, his fingers moving with a surgical precision that hadn't surfaced in 5 years. He didn't think about his lost truck or his ruined career. He didn't think about Jax. He only thought about the fluid. He expertly spiked a bag of chilled saline and threaded the catheter into Daisy's vein on the first try. "Alcohol on the paw pads and ears," Elias commanded, and Sarah, who had followed them in, immediately began dabbing the cooling liquid onto the dog's extremities to draw the heat away from her core. Suddenly, the monitor connected to Daisy's chest flatlined. The long, high-pitched tone of a heart that had given up filled the small room. Dr. Aris froze for a second, but Elias was already moving. He began chest compressions, rhythmic, powerful thrusts that mimicked the life he refused to let go of. 1, 2, 3. "Come on, Daisy," he whispered, sweat dripping from his chin onto the metal table. "You didn't survive that bag just to quit on me here." Peaches had crawled under the exam table, her small body tucked against the cold metal legs, watching Elias with an intensity that felt like a prayer. 10 seconds passed. 20. The high-pitched tone of the monitor continued, a relentless reminder of his past failures. Elias felt the familiar shadow of Erbil creeping in, the phantom weight of Jax's head in his lap. But then he felt something else. He felt the cold saline pumping through the line. He felt the heat finally beginning to break under his hands. He gave one final, concentrated thrust. The monitor chirped. Then again. A weak, erratic blip appeared on the screen, followed by a wet, hacking cough from Daisy. Her amber eyes snapped open, wide with a sudden, sharp clarity as she sucked in a lungful of oxygen. Elias slumped against the exam table, his hands finally beginning to shake. But they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from the sheer, kinetic rush of a victory he had waited 5 years to win. He looked down at his calloused palms and realized they were steady for the first time since 2021. "She's back," Dr. Eris whispered, checking the vitals. "She's not out of the woods, but she's back." Elias exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for half a decade. He looked at Sarah, who was wiping her own brow, and then at the door. The adrenaline was fading, but the tactical medic in him was still scanning for threats. "Sarah, that truck," Elias began, but he was interrupted by the sound of the clinic's front door bell chiming. Sarah stepped toward the hallway to check, but she stopped dead. She turned back to Elias, her face pale. "Thorne, I just got a ping from my radio. Dispatch found your rig at mile marker 242. The trailer is open and the cargo is gone. But that's not the worst part." She held up an evidence bag containing a second set of the industrial zip ties Elias had found earlier. "They found these inside your cab. Someone didn't just follow us here, they've been in your truck the whole time." As the realization hit him, Elias heard a low, menacing growl from Peaches under the table, her eyes fixed not on the hallway, but on the back exit of the clinic that led directly to the alleyway. The sterile air of the Elko clinic felt like a vacuum as the weight of Sarah's words settled over Elias. Outside, the Nevada sun was finally beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the Great Basin in bruised purples and oranges, but inside the atmosphere had turned cold. Elias stood by the exam table, his hand resting on Daisy's flank. He could feel the faint, rhythmic thrum of her heart, a fragile victory he wasn't prepared to lose. "They were in my cab," Elias repeated, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Leatherman Wave Plus, the steel cool against his palm. He wasn't thinking like a trucker anymore. He was back in the headspace of a 68W combat medic on a compromised LZ. The zip ties weren't just for the dogs. They were a signature. Or a warning. Sarah nodded, her jaw set tight. "My dispatch ran the serial numbers you found on the asphalt. They aren't just industrial. They're part of a restricted procurement lot for Vane Development. They're the firm currently bulldozing the North Ridge for that luxury resort project. But here's the kicker. The land they're fighting the most for, the Sentinel parcel, is technically listed under a Thorne family trust." Elias looked down at Daisy. The Sentinel Project was the name his grandfather had given the old family ranch, a dream of building a sanctuary for retired military canines that Elias had walked away from after Jax died. He had spent 4 years trying to forget that land existed, but it seemed the land hadn't forgotten him. "The freight I was hauling," Elias said, his mind racing through the manifests. "It wasn't just specialized medical equipment. It was high-end canine telemetry and field surgery kits, the exact tech needed to outfit a rehabilitation center. My company didn't tell me where it was going, just that it was a priority delivery to Elko." "Vane didn't just want the land," Sarah whispered. "They wanted the gear and they wanted you off the road. They used the dogs as bait, Elias. They knew a man with your record, a Silver Star medic, wouldn't drive past a puppy in distress." A low, vibrating growl erupted from beneath the exam table. Peaches was no longer tucked away in fear. She was standing, her ears pinned back and her hackles raised. She wasn't looking at Elias or Sarah. Her dark, glossy eyes were fixed on the back service entrance of the clinic, a heavy steel door that led to a dark alley. Click. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in a combat zone, the metallic slide of a bolt being eased forward. "Sarah down?" Elias lunged, sweeping Dr. Eris behind a heavy lead-lined X-ray barrier just as the glass in the back door shattered. The heat of the desert rushed into the air-conditioned room, carrying the scent of dust and ozone. A shadow moved in the doorway, a man silhouetted against the twilight, holding a Sauer P320. It was the driver of the white Ford F-150. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need one in a town where the law was often bought by the highest bidder. "Give us the dogs and the encrypted drive from the truck's black box, Thorne," the man rasped. "You're a long way from the army. Nobody has to die in a vet's office tonight." Elias felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the tactical clarity, that narrowed his vision until only the threat remained. He didn't have a sidearm, but he had a clinic full of specialized tools and a mind trained for unconventional warfare. He glanced at the crash cart next to him. "You want the dogs?" Elias's voice was steady, devoid of fear. "You'll have to go through the medic who brought them back from the dead." He grabbed a canister of pressurized oxygen from the cart, his fingers working with a disciplined speed. He didn't throw it. Instead, he kicked the brake locks on the exam table, sending the heavy metal structure sliding toward the intruder. The man fired, the round thudding into the thick padding of the table, but the distraction was enough. Elias grabbed a bottle of isopropyl alcohol and a handful of gauze, his hands moving in a blur. He didn't need a gun to create a diversion. He was a master of improvised trauma care, and in a pinch, that meant he knew exactly how to turn a healing environment into a tactical obstacle. As the intruder stepped further into the room, Peaches didn't wait for a command. The 10-week-old puppy, driven by a high-drive genetic code that Vane had clearly underestimated, launched herself at the man's leg. She was small, but she was a German shepherd, and her teeth found the soft tissue above his boot with a ferocity that made him howl. The man stumbled, his aim drifting. Sarah used the opening to draw her duty weapon, her voice booming with the authority of the BLM. "Drop it. Now." The intruder hissed in pain, kicking Peaches away and retreating back into the darkness of the alley. The sound of a high-powered engine roared to life, tires screaming against the gravel as the white truck sped away into the night. Elias sprinted to the door, checking the perimeter before slamming the deadbolt. He turned back to the room, his heart hammering. Peaches was shaken but standing, her tail tucked but her eyes still focused on the door. Daisy had lifted her head, her amber eyes wide with a growing intelligence, as if she finally understood that the man with the scarred hands was the only thing standing between her and the bag. "They're not going to stop," Dr. Aris said, her voice trembling as she emerged from behind the X-ray shield. "If they're willing to kill for that land." "They aren't just killing for land," Elias said, picking up a stray piece of paper that had fallen from the intruder's pocket during the scuffle. He unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he read the coordinates and the name typed at the bottom of the page. It wasn't just a development plan. It was an extraction manifest for something buried deep beneath the Sentinel Project Ranch, something that had been missing since the end of the Cold War. Elias looked at the industrial zip ties on the table, then at the dogs who had led him here. He realized then that Daisy wasn't just a victim of cruelty. She was the only living creature that knew exactly where Vane's men had been digging before they tried to silence her. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice cold and purposeful. "We aren't staying here. We're going to the ranch." "Thorne, that's suicide," Sarah argued. "We need to call in the state police." "The state police are 20 miles away and Vane owns the road," Elias countered. He looked at Daisy, who was now attempting to stand on her own, her strength returning with a miraculous, stubborn persistence. "She knows the way. And I think I know why they're so afraid of a dog who can find things that are meant to stay buried." As Elias began to pack his trauma kit, his eyes caught a final detail on the crumpled paper, a date for the final clearing that was less than 12 hours away. But it was the secondary logo on the document that stopped his heart. A logo belonging to the same private military contractor he had served with in Erbil, the very men who had been responsible for the mission where Jax had died. The moon over the Great Basin was a cold, silver sliver that did little to cut through the oppressive darkness of the Nevada night. It was July 2026, and though the record-breaking 118-degree heat of the day had retreated, the desert floor still radiated a stubborn dry warmth that smelled of sage and impending rain. Elias Thorne sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's BLM SUV, his hands resting on his knees, his mind running through the SLU to report format he hadn't used since his last patrol in Iraq. Beside him, Sarah drove with the headlights off, navigating by the faint glow of the dashboard and a pair of PVS-14 night vision monoculars he'd coached her to use. In the back, Daisy lay surprisingly still, her strength returning with a tenacity that defied her recent brush with death. Peaches was tucked against her mother's flank, her small ears twitching at every shift in the wind. Elias could feel the tactical shift in the air. They were no longer just a rescue team. They were an infiltration unit. 3 miles to the Sentinel Project Ranch boundary, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. "The main access road is usually empty, but my thermal sensors are picking up heat signatures that shouldn't be there." Elias took the night vision optics, the green phosphor world snapping into high-contrast clarity. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Thorne family land, the Sentinel Project Ranch didn't look like the sanctuary his grandfather had envisioned. It looked like a forward operating base. High-intensity floodlights carved aggressive paths through the dark, illuminating a fleet of white Ford F-150s parked in a disciplined line near the old barn. Heavy machinery, backhoes and specialized drilling rigs, groaned in the distance, tearing into the earth near the north ridge. Men in slate-gray tactical vests, carrying suppressed short-barreled rifles, moved with the synchronized precision of professional operators. "Vane development brought in the heavy hitters," Elias muttered, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a familiar patch on the lead operator's shoulder. It was the stylized hawk of the same private military contractor he had served with in Erbil, the men who had been present when Jax died. These aren't security guards. They're a recovery team. Why would a land developer need combat veterans and drilling rigs for a resort? Sarah asked, her hand moving to the grip of her sidearm. Because they aren't looking for resort space, Elias said. He reached into his pocket and felt the industrial zip ties he'd recovered from the roadside, the signature of men who didn't leave witnesses. They're looking for this sentinel, cache. My grandfather used to tell stories about a Cold War-era bunker buried under the ranch, something the government forgot to decommission. I thought it was just the ramblings of an old soldier. Vane clearly knows better. They parked the SUV in a deep wash a half-mile from the perimeter. Elias checked his IFAK and his Leatherman Wave Plus, the tools of a medic now serving as the gear of a saboteur. He looked at Daisy. She had struggled to her feet, her amber eyes fixed on the ranch with a strange, magnetic focus. She didn't bark. She simply nudged Elias's hand and looked toward the fence line. She knows where the breach is, Elias realized. She's been there. They moved through the sagebrush in a low-profile crawl, the dogs moving with a silent, instinctive discipline that suggested they understood the stakes. As they reached the chain-link fence, Elias spotted the stolen K9 telemetry gear he had been hauling in his Peterbilt 579. It was laid out on a folding table near the excavation site, the encrypted drives glowing with a soft blue light as they processed data from sensors buried deep in the soil. Suddenly Daisy went rigid. She let out a low, vibrating huff, not a growl but a signal. Elias followed her gaze toward the center of the dig site. The drilling rig had stopped, and a group of men were gathered around a massive rusted steel hatch that had been unearthed beneath 10 feet of Nevada silt. One of the men, a tall figure in a tailored tactical jacket, stepped forward. He held a device that looked like a high-end metal detector, but the frequency it emitted caused Peaches to whine in pain. "They've found it," Sarah hissed, her binoculars fixed on the hatch. Elias watched as the men attached heavy chains to the hatch, the backhoe beginning to groan as it took the strain. But as the steel groaned and began to shift, the ground beneath the ranch began to vibrate, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that didn't sound like machinery. It sounded like a countdown. Daisy lunged forward, not toward the men, but toward a secondary air vent hidden behind a clump of rocks. She began to dig with a frantic, desperate energy, her claws tearing into the dry earth as if she were trying to reach something before the main hatch opened. "Thorne, we have to move," Sarah said, pointing to a patrol of 3 men approaching their position with thermal scanners. Elias looked from the approaching guards to the dogs, then to the massive hatch that was now inches from being ripped open. He realized then that the Sentinel project wasn't just a ranch or a bunker. It was a lock. And the industrial zip ties hadn't been to stop Daisy from breathing, they had been to stop her from pointing the way to the one thing Vane was terrified of finding. As the first guard's thermal beam swept over their position, the hatch gave way with a deafening crack of protesting metal. But instead of a horde of Cold War secrets, a sound emerged from the dark that stopped Elias's heart, a high-pitched digital whistle that perfectly matched the missing K9 beacon from his lost partner Jax's collar. Elias stared into the yawning black hole of the bunker, his hand tightening on his medic's kit. He saw the first man descend into the dark, but then the radio on the guard's shoulder erupted with a frantic, terrified scream from the pit. "It's not empty." Thorne's logbook was right. The Sentinel is still active. The scream echoing from the black maw of the bunker was a jagged blade that sliced through the desert silence. Elias Thorne didn't hesitate. The operational cynicism that had dictated his life for 4 years was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency of a 68W combat medic. He didn't need a command to move. The high-pitched digital whistle, the exact frequency of Jax's recovery beacon, was a tether pulling him toward the edge of the abyss. "Sarah, cover the rear. I'm going in." Elias shouted over the rising mechanical thrumming that shook the very foundation of the ranch. He grabbed a high-intensity tactical flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting a path through the dust-choked air. He didn't have a rifle, but he had his Leatherman and the weight of a debt he owed to the past. Daisy was already at the lip of the hole, her amber eyes reflecting the silver moonlight as she let out a low, urgent whine. She didn't hesitate either. She vanished into the darkness, her paws clicking against the rusted rungs of the vertical access ladder. Peaches was a shadow at her heels, her small frame disappearing into the void with a bravery that made Elias's chest tighten. Elias swung himself over the edge. The air inside the shaft was stale, smelling of ozone, ancient grease, and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. As he descended, the light from above narrowed until it was just a pinprick of white in a sea of ink. 20 feet down, his boots hit a concrete floor with a heavy thud. The bunker wasn't just a room, it was a sprawling subterranean complex, the walls lined with deactivated server racks and lead-shielded conduits. He swept his light across the corridor. The Vane recovery team was in disarray. 2 operators were slumped against the wall, clutching their heads as a localized sonic pulse, the Sentinel defense system, ripped through the air. The tall man in the tactical jacket was further down the hall, his hand hovering over a reinforced crate that had been pulled from a high-security vault. "Stay back, Thorn," the man yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of greed and terror. "This belongs to the contractors now. You were just the delivery boy." Elias ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the crate. It wasn't just a container, it was a mobile life support pod, the same kind used for high-value K9 assets in active war zones. The digital readout on the side was blinking in a rapid, frantic red. Critical failure, oxygen low, cardiac distress detected. "You've been keeping it alive," Elias whispered, the horror of the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "All this time. You didn't leave Jackson Herbal. You extracted him." The truth was a sickening weight. Vane hadn't just wanted the land, they wanted this Sentinel, a project that had used Jax as the primary test subject for experimental K9 Neuralink technology. When the mission went wrong in 2021, they had faked the death to avoid a Senate inquiry, hidden the dog in a Cold War bunker on Thornland, and waited for the tech to mature. "He's a prototype, Elias," the man screamed, reaching for a remote detonator. "He's worth more than the entire ranch." The ground shuddered again, more violently this time. The monster storm Elias had been outrunning on I-80 had finally hit the North Cascades, and the pressure shift was triggering a catastrophic failure in the bunker's aging structural supports. Above them, the sound of the landslide began, a low, grinding roar of earth and rock shifting above their heads. "The crate is losing power." Elias lunged forward. He didn't look at the detonator or the man. He only looked at the life support pod. "Sarah, get the dogs out. Now." Daisy suddenly leaped from the shadows, her teeth sinking into the man's forearm before he could thumb the switch. He cried out, dropping the remote as Peaches circled him, her high-pitched barks adding to the sensory overload of the sonic pulse. Elias hit the floor next to the crate, his fingers flying over the emergency release valves. He used his Leatherman to bypass the electronic lock, the steel blade sparking against the wires. The lid hissed open, releasing a cloud of chilled, sterile mist. Inside, resting on a bed of medical-grade foam, was a Belgian Malinois with a graying muzzle and a jagged scar across his shoulder that Elias knew by heart. Jax's eyes were closed, his breathing nearly non-existent, but his heart was still beating, a slow, stubborn thrum that refused to give up. "I've got you, partner," Elias choked out, his hands moving to the dog's neck to find a pulse. "Extraction initiated. I'm taking you home." The ceiling groaned, a massive crack spider webbing across the concrete above the vault. Dust and debris began to rain down as the weight of the mountain pushed against the bunker's limits. Elias looked up, seeing the first signs of the final collapse. He had seconds to get Jax, Daisy, and Peaches out before the Sentinel project became a permanent tomb for all of them. He grabbed the heavy-duty handles of the internal pod, his muscles screaming as he prepared for a high-angle rescue that would require every ounce of strength he had left. But as he lifted the crate, a secondary alarm on the bunker's mainframe began to wail, and a voice over the intercom, cold, synthesized, and final, announced the activation of the bunker's scorched earth protocol. The vault doors began to slide shut, threatening to seal Elias and Jax inside the dark forever, but it was the sight through the narrowing gap that made Elias freeze. A second recovery team from Vane was descending from the surface, and they weren't carrying rescue gear. They were carrying thermite charges designed to incinerate the evidence, and everyone still breathing inside. The July air over the Montana Valley was a soft, golden blanket, a stark contrast to the lethal, vibrating kiln of mile marker 242 exactly 1 year ago. In July 2027, the heat was no longer an enemy to be outrun or a weight to be survived. It was a companion to the silence of a life finally reclaimed. Elias Thorne sat on the wide timber porch of the ranch house, his large, scarred hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that he no longer needed to drink for survival, but for the simple, quiet pleasure of the morning. At his feet, Daisy lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight. Her black and tan fur, once matted with dust and soaked in the condensation of a suffocating plastic tomb, was now thick, shiny, and healthy. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm that Elias still found himself monitoring out of habit. a remnant of the frantic medic who had performed doggy CPR on the side of Interstate 80. She wasn't blue-tongued or limp anymore. She was the matriarch of the Guardian's Rest, the sanctuary Elias had built from the ruins of his family's legacy and his own shattered past. In the distance, near the fence line of the north pasture, Peaches was a blur of dark fur and kinetic energy. The 10-week-old bundle of rags that had once stood in the middle of a highway to stop a Peterbilt 579 was now a powerful high-drive yearling. She was engaged in a mock battle with a tattered training sleeve, her tail wagging with a ferocity that spoke of a dog who knew she was loved and, more importantly, that she was home. Beside her, Jax, the Belgian Malinois Elias had pulled from the dark of the Sentinel bunker, watched with the calm, stoic wisdom of a veteran who had finally been allowed to retire. Elias looked at his hands. They were steady. The tremors of survivor's guilt that had plagued him since 2021 had been replaced by the calluses of physical labor, building kennels, fixing fences, and nursing broken things back to health. He thought about the multi-thousand-dollar load he had abandoned on the shoulder of the road and the career he had thrown away in a single moment of choice. He didn't miss the road. He didn't miss the operational cynicism that had been his only armor. He reached down and scratched Daisy behind the ears, right where the fur was softest. She looked up at him with amber eyes that were no longer shattered or terrified, but full of a deep, abiding trust. He realized then that the rescue hadn't ended at the clinic in Elko or at the mouth of the bunker. It was an ongoing mission, one that happened every time a dog wagged its tail or a veteran found peace on this land. The sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. The world was quiet, but it wasn't the empty, haunting quiet of his truck cab. It was the full, vibrant silence of a sanctuary. Elias realized that his watch hadn't ended, it had just changed frequency. He had spent his life trying to save people and animals from the dark, never realizing that he was the one who needed to be led into the light. The puppy didn't just drag her mother out of a bag that day. She dragged a man out of the dark. As the three of them stood silhouetted against the fire-orange mountain sunset, the peace was absolute. The Sentinel was no longer a hidden bunker or a corporate secret. It was the man and the dog standing watch over a future where no one was ever left behind again. Elias Thorne thought his most important mission was behind him, buried in the dust of a war far away. He didn't know that his true purpose would begin with a freezing puppy and a truck handle in a desert heatwave. If you believe that even the most broken hearts can find a reason to beat again, and that every loyal friend deserves a second chance, hit like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had an animal save you when you were at your lowest? God bless and stay frosty. Elias Thorne spent years haunted by a partner he couldn't save, living in the silence of a truck cab to avoid the world. It took a dying mother dog and a brave puppy to drag him back into the light. Like this video if you believe in second chances for both humans and animals. Subscribe to join the mission at the Guardian's Rest. Comment, never leave a partner behind, to show Elias, and every veteran like him, that their watch is never truly over.